Committee Room 29. Sound.
Okay, so just going to provide a brief overview of today's business. So the committee will receive oral evidence from the Department for Infrastructure on the review of residents' parking. We're going to receive oral evidence from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council on its report on the financial sustainability of water delivery services in Northern Ireland. We're going to consider one proposal for statutory rules subject to assembly procedure and consider 3 statutory rules and 1 proposal for a statutory rule not subject to assembly procedure. We have 3 work experience students in the gallery today. You're very, very welcome to the Committee for Infrastructure. I hope you're enjoying your time up here. We have Danielle, Olivia and Sam. Like I say to everybody, I hope this committee doesn't put you off politics, but you're very welcome to the committee today. For those who are in the public gallery, you can use your mobile devices through a Wi-Fi connection. All devices should be muted. 3G, 4G and 5G should not be used, and no recordings or photographs are to be taken. So if members are content, we'll proceed through the agenda as follows. Apologies. We have Keith joining us online, Nicola joining us online. We potentially may have John Stewart joining us later on in the meeting. Declarations of interest. Remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now or when the particular matter arises during the meeting. So, does any members have any interest that they wish to declare? No? Okay. Item 3 is chairperson's business. So you may have seen yesterday in the news that one of the unions has decided to prepare for strike action over the summer months in relation to TransLink, and this may have an impact on events over the summer. As we know, we've big events happening in Northern Ireland, one being the Open next month. So I'm just seeking agreement that we write to both TransLink and the department, just seeking details of the conversations that they're having in relation to negotiations around pay for TransLink staff at this moment in time, and also just to seek details of contingency planning that they may be doing during the strike, because obviously those events will be global events as well, with a lot of visitors here to Northern Ireland. So it's important that we have contingency plans there in place for transport. Are you content with that? Yeah. There was also news today, although it is not necessarily our remit because it is water quality, but you may have seen in terms of a report where Northern Ireland's rivers and lakes are failing to meet the safety standards, and I think it might be worthwhile just to check in with the Minister, Dara, just to check to see whether NIEA are obviously, I would like to think, investigating this, but obviously the causes and the impacts of this, and particularly to find out if NI Water is a causation of any of the pollution instances, because NI Water is one of the main things that we can then look at as a committee. Obviously water quality rests with DAERA, so are you content with that? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 4, which is the draft minutes. At page 7 you'll see draft minutes of the proceeding of the meeting on the 11th of June 2025. So I'm just seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 11th of June 2025. If so, I'll sign the minutes now. Are you content?
Great.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Item 5 is matters arising. So does any members have any matters arising at this moment in time? No? Okay. Item 6 is correspondence. At page 18 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 26 there's correspondence from the Department for Infrastructure regarding the public consultation document on potential policy proposals which could be included in the Rail and Transport Bill. So I'm just seeking agreement that we schedule an oral evidence session following the end of the consultation period on the 12th of September 2025. Are you agreed?
Please.
Yeah. At page 51, you'll see response from the Minister for Infrastructure to committee correspondence requesting details of funding to community transport schemes. I didn't think that this piece of correspondence really gave us any more detail from the Minister just in relation to the breakdown, which is what we had asked as a committee. You'll all be aware the Minister had said in press reports that the community transport is fully funded, but we've no indication here really of what that looks like in terms of a figure. So I'm just seeking agreement that we write back to the Minister, firstly thanking her for her response, but also requesting the detailed breakdown of funding for community transport. And I would like to see the breakdown per community association and the difference between what was requested by each and what was awarded. Are members content with that?
Yep.
Yeah?
Right, yeah.
Okay, thank you. At page 52, you'll see response from the Minister for Infrastructure to committee correspondence requesting details of the cross-departmental working group, including membership and the regularity of meetings. And we also asked of any plans to extend the membership. So I think we'll just send that across to Community Transport Association for their information if you're agreed with that, or if there was anything you wanted to query. Okay, agreed then? Okay, thank you. Then at page 54, you'll see response from the Minister for Infrastructure to the committee correspondence requesting information on the alleged driving licence fraud story that had broke a couple of weeks ago. I don't think it's unreasonable for the committee. We still don't have any details in relation to what has come back to the committee. I don't think it's unreasonable that we seek a timeline from the Minister. We do not want to obviously jeopardise any police investigation or case that is ongoing at this moment in time. That's not what we are seeking or intending to do. But as a committee, I just think the importance of this in terms of road safety, which is one of our strategic priorities, it's key that we do get some detail around this and understand where this could potentially be going. So I'm seeking agreement that we write back to the Minister just requesting a timeline of when the internal investigation started and concluded with DVA, when the Minister was made aware of allegations, and when the police were made aware of investigations. And we may not get fully this, but given my first comments in relation to the ongoing investigation, but it would be good to know just in terms of figures of anybody that has been suspended as a result of the investigation. So are members content with that or want to add anything further?
Content, Chair.
Content? Okay, thank you. At pages 55 and 61, you'll see correspondence in relation to trust ports in which the Minister states she is still considering options following the consultation. So I think, to be honest, I think there was a wee bit of ambiguity there for me in terms of this piece of legislation we always understood would be potentially coming to the committee. And we've obviously heard evidence in relation to the public consultation side from the likes of the Harbour Commissioner's office that we were down with recently. And I think broadly there's support for this. And one of our main aims is to see legislation come forward to the committee that we can scrutinise if that is to be the case. So I'm just seeking agreement that we write to the Minister ensuring her of the committee's support in terms of looking for this piece of legislation in respect of trust ports, and to get a clear timescale of when we might see this come to the committee. Are you content with that approach? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then page 58, you'll see response from the Minister for Infrastructure to committee correspondence asking if the department is in discussions with DAERA in relation to wastewater in Belfast Lough. So I'm just seeking agreement that we forward to the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs for information, or is anybody anything they want to add? or seek clarity? Peter,
Just one thing, Chair. I'm reading through it now, and obviously there was an adjournment debate on the Living with Water Belfast programme because of the impact it's going to have on residents in East Belfast and North Down. But flicking through this here, one of the paragraphs on page 58, in the New Decade New Approach Agreement, Living with Water was identified as a beneficiary of increased funding from the British Government. However, this was not received. Can we get clarity as to why that was the case?
Yeah.
That's quite significant if that's the case. So a bit more information would be great.
Yeah, no, we can get clarity just in relation to that. Are you content with that, members? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then, sorry, I should have said there, page 61, we've obviously that second piece of correspondence for the Department for Infrastructure just in relation to the review of trust ports. So provisionally we have scheduled some work on that for September, just in relation to that. So that's why I'm just keen to get some details around timescales from the Minister when we see that legislation.
Sorry, just when you say that work, does that mean that officials will be briefing us on the consultation, or what does that?
Well, the hope would be that we would have some more detail in relation to the legislation, and obviously then the officials would be up and briefing the committee and that type of thing, so we can take a look at it then whenever we have further details, and obviously they'll be called for evidence and that type of thing that would go out afterwards.
Just because the report was a sort of a surmise, so it'd be good to sort of be able to go into that a bit more, because it didn't seem very clear cut, some of the responses.
Absolutely, yeah. I didn't think the responses were as clear cut as they could have been, because as the committee understood, this was always a legislative change that needed to come, and that was always in the get-go from the inception of the committee being up, so it'd be good to see something come forward pretty soon in relation to it. Okay, pages 81 to 94, there's correspondence from a member of the public with the Public Accounts Committee referred to this committee on a planning matter. So I'm just seeking agreement that we write to the individual advising that the committee does not deal with individual cases and has no role in complaints handling role, and refer them to their local MLAs in the first instance, and to highlight the work of the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman. Are members content? Okay, thank you. And at page 103, you'll see correspondence from an individual regarding a complaint about TransLink bus services. So I'm seeking agreement that we write to the individual advising them of the same, that basically the committee has no role in considering individual complaints and refer them to their local MLAs in the first instance, and to highlight the work of the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman. Everybody content?
Content.
Okay, is there any other items of correspondence that anybody wishes to raise, anything or any issues coming out of them?
Chair.
Yeah. Sorry, Keith.
I'm just trying to pull it up again here. Page 56. Response regarding the £3 million on. Do you remember that was discussed at the Belfast Harbour Day? Am I correct? And that was the planning stuff. The 3 million. I'm just not clear what that's doing. If you look at bullet point 2 on page 56, does that sum up what that £3 million is going to be spent on? Bullet point 2.
Well, I think to be fair, Keith, all the bullet points are potentially summarising what the 3 million and what the work is meant to do in terms of the transformation planning bid. Do you want to seek some further clarity or detail on a breakdown?
We'll see the terms of reference. To be fair, they're not completed yet.
Yeah.
The second paragraph down, so maybe that will make it more clear. It did help, to be fair. That has helped a bit, but just not 100% clear. But the terms of reference probably will finish that question up, to be fair.
Yeah.
Leave it at that.
We'll have to keep a tight eye just in relation to the terms of reference coming back to the committee. And to be honest, it might be something that we might think about having another session on. But we'll see once the terms of reference come back to the committee. You happy with that, Keith?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, any other items of correspondence? Okay, so your members, are you content to note the remaining correspondence is contained in the meeting pack? Content, yeah. Okay, item 7 is SL1, the Plan of Miscellaneous Amendments Regulation Northern Ireland 2025. Page 105, you'll see the SL1, the Plan of Miscellaneous Amendments Regulations Northern Ireland 2025. The rule is subject to negative resolution. These provisions have been developed as part of the review of the Planning Development Management Regulations Northern Ireland 2015. The Development Management Regulations brought forward by the Department, local government and other stakeholders to deliver change through the Planning Improvement Programme. These measures and recommendations emerged through the call for evidence as part of the review of the implementation of the 2011 Act required under Section 228 of that Act. Members, I don't know whether you've anything that you want to ask in relation to that. I did have a few questions just how that would actually work in practice. And I was maybe thinking just even for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, very quickly, if we had an official up just to brief us on that. I'm just thinking around the transparency of the process, any costs that may be incurred, what that will mean for public engagement, that type of thing. Has anybody any queries or anything that they want to add? Content with that we just get an official up just for a few minutes just to check in relation to that before we agree it? Content? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Item 8 is subordinate legislation. SR is not subject to assembly procedure. So advise members that there are 3 statutory rules that are not subject to assembly proceedings and are not required to be laid. These are pages 109 to 123 of the meeting pack, and they are the SR 2025-105, the Road Races Down Rally Order Northern Ireland 2025, SR 2025-106, the Road Races Armoy Motorcycle Road Race Order Northern Ireland 2025, and the SR 2025-108, Loading Bays on Roads Amendment number 3, Order Northern Ireland 2025. So I'm just asking that you're content to note the statutory rules. Yep. Content, thank you. Item 9 is subordinate legislation SL1 not subject to assembly procedure. So there is one proposal SL1 for a statutory rule that is not subject to assembly proceedings and is not required to be laid. This is listed at page 125 and it is the SL1, the Parking and Waiting Restrictions Lisburn Amendment Order Northern Ireland 2025. Has anybody any issues that they wish to raise on this? No? Okay, thank you. So members, you're content with the proposal for the statutory rule? Content? Yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to our first evidence session. So item 10 is review of residence parking. Department for Infrastructure oral evidence. At page 129 you'll see the clerk's memo. At page 132 you'll see update on the review of residence parking. Department for Infrastructure written evidence. At page 139 you'll see the official report review of residence parking, 22nd of January 2025. And we welcome to the committee today Ms. Laura Irvine, Head of Parking Policy, Department for Infrastructure, and Mr. Mark White, Parking Policy, Department for Infrastructure. As per usual, I'm just seeking agreement that the evidence is recorded by Hansard. All agreed, yeah? Agreed, yeah. Thank you. Excuse me. You're very welcome, Laura and Mark, to the committee today. We do appreciate your time and coming up to us on this issue, which can be very controversial in local areas, but is something that merits some discussion in terms of the committee. So we do obviously have some of the information that you've provided to the committee, so if you don't mind, I'm going to give you 5 minutes just to brief the committee and then I'll come to members' questions, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members, for providing us with the opportunity to brief you today on the Department's proposed approach to residence parking schemes going forward. Following officials' briefing to committee on the outcomes and recommendations from the residence parking review at the end of January of this year, we have been developing an application and assessment process for residence parking schemes going forward. We have also been considering where amendments to the current process could potentially address some of the challenges faced in delivering against this policy over previous years. As members are aware, while the residents' parking review found that the scheme in the Rugby Road, College Avenue Park area of Belfast has worked well, there were a number of challenges identified that had resulted in other schemes not being able to be taken forward. These challenges included the resource-intensive nature of the current departmental process and the inability to secure the level of buy-in required from residents and businesses in the areas. Currently, the first stage of the residents' parking process is initial consultation and design, and as outlined in the review findings, this is a resource-intensive process, especially in relation to staff time. Committing to undertake this initial stage for every scheme request is no longer feasible, especially given the level of demand for schemes across Northern Ireland. In addition, the ability to secure the required level of buy-in from residents has also directly impacted on cost. Significant resource has been focused on schemes that have failed to secure the necessary buy-in from residents, whether this be at initial design and consultation phase or at formal consultation. Therefore, ensuring residents' buy-in from the very outset, and indeed at each stage of the process, we believe will be fundamental in ensuring successful delivery and implementation of future schemes. Resultantly, as you will have seen, we are proposing to introduce 3 new stages to the current residents' parking review process. This is in a bid to address some of the challenges that I have outlined. We are seeking to introduce an application process for demand-led schemes, which we have entitled Stage 1. Stage 2, which would be an assessment process for all schemes, and then a review process at Stage 8. In addition, whilst the fundamental principles of the residents' parking policy will remain unchanged, there are elements based on the residents' parking review where amendments to the current process could address some of the previous challenges we faced. Solutions identified by the department include introducing a larger percentage buy-in from residents at the feasibility and design stage of the process. At both the design and formal consultation stage, not amending scheme designs unless there are fundamental issues to be addressed, and not considering an application for the same area or street until after 5 years, unless there's been a significant change in circumstances. It is envisaged that these solutions will ensure resources are dedicated to schemes with a high probability of successful delivery and implementation. Whilst detail has been provided to members of the proposed process, I will pass over to Mark, who will give a wee bit more detail in relation to Stage 1 and Stage 2.
The proposed application process for demand-led schemes at Stage 1 has been introduced to address the significant level of requests for resident parking schemes across Northern Ireland and to provide the Department with the means to ensure that requests can be appropriately and fairly considered going forward. An application form will be made available on NI Direct and the Department's website, supported by an overview of what a residence parking scheme is, how it works, and a frequently asked questions section. These resources will provide any potential applicant with as much information as possible to allow them to consider whether a scheme is suitable for their area before submitting an application. To ensure effective management of the process, we are proposing that the application process will be time-bound on an annual basis, and that any application in Stage 1 must meet the following criteria: that there is evidence of commuter parking or other nuisance parking impacting residents that could be addressed by a residence parking scheme, with the applicant providing details of this, including times and days, to support their application. That levels of parking conflict within the area are ongoing for a sustained period and not just a short-term variation in parking patterns. That all streets proposed for a scheme must be adopted, and that a significant number of residents do not have off-street parking available to them. And finally, that evidence is provided by the applicant to demonstrate that there is support from those in the area for a residence parking scheme to be introduced. Demand-led applications must meet the Stage 1 criteria in order to progress to Stage 2, the initial consultation and assessment stage. Applications that do not meet the criteria will be informed that the request has been unsuccessful and advised of the reason why. The assessment process being proposed at Stage 2 will be applicable to all potential residence parking schemes. Demand-led schemes that have met the criteria outlined in Stage 1, as well as any potential schemes identified by the Department through the development of parking strategies in support of the local transport plans. Currently, the first stage of the residence parking scheme process is the consultation and design phase. However, given that the level of demand for residence parking schemes, the department is not in a position to consult and design a concept for every request it receives from residents. It is therefore envisaged that this assessment process at stage 2 will seek to ensure that schemes can be assessed and prioritised going forward. Under the proposed assessment process, the department will issue a letter including key information and frequently asked questions on residence parking to all residents within a proposed scheme to ascertain there is evidence of significant support for a scheme in that area. It is proposed that response rate of over 50% of those balloted being in support of a residence parking zone for their area will be required in order for the scheme to progress any further. Where there is over 50% support from residents for a scheme, the department will then carry out an initial assessment of the proposed scheme to determine that within the area of the scheme, not more than 50% of properties have off-street parking available, and that there is sufficient available parking to implement a workable scheme. Following confirmation that the scheme satisfies this assessment, the department will undertake initial engagement with the PSNI and the relevant local council to confirm they are supportive of a potential residence parking scheme for the area proposed. Subject to agreement and following wider engagement with the relevant stakeholders of the scheme, the department will then procure and arrange necessary traffic and parking surveys to confirm the viability of the scheme before commencing to the design stage, as per the current policy at stage 3. For any applications that do not meet the required criteria at any stage of the process or fail to garner the necessary resident support at stage 2 or stage 3, it is proposed that, similar to the approach taken elsewhere, the department will not reconsider a scheme for this area for another 5 years unless there has been a significant change in circumstances within that area.
Thank you, Mark. So in addition to these 2 new additional stages that Mark has outlined, the department also proposes introducing a review stage to the process, and this will allow the department to review schemes periodically to ensure that they remain fit for purpose, that they're still supported by residents, and that they remain value for money. If following a review, any of these objectives outlined are no longer applicable, the scheme will be removed. In these cases, the department again will not reconsider a scheme for another 5 years or at all, depending on the findings of the review. I would like to stress that what has been shared with members today is very much a proposal. We're also mindful that the introduction of any new process, especially like this, will need to be reviewed periodically to ensure that it is working and that lessons can be learned and the process altered if necessary. We very much welcome the committee's consideration of the department's proposed approach and any questions or suggestions that members may have, and your feedback will help shape and inform the process going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that, and for an update just in relation to what has been happening on residence parking. I just wanted to kick off, first of all, the last time that we had discussed this at committee, there was a figure in and around 230, which was a huge figure for a small team working on this. Has there begun to be a review of that 230 odd applications that are there in the system at this moment in time to try and work through where might be strategically identified schemes or demand in relation to them?
No, Chair. We actually have over 305 requests in at the moment. I think the difficulty for us within the department is that we are issued with a request with no additional information. We're not resourced to be able to look at all these requests and be able to go and undertake site visits and identify what the parking issues or pressures might be in that area. So it is therefore proposed that any previous schemes other than those that the department is already committed to will have to go through this new process. So whether that be stage 1 in relation to demand-led schemes or stage 2 in relation to those that are already under consideration by the department and those that make it successfully through stage 1.
Okay. The other thing I'm sort of thinking in my head as well in relation to it, and particularly the case when it comes to like a review process as well, what discussions happen internally from colleagues in DFI where there may be a new road scheme being developed there, or, you know, and that might be the case with some of the 305 that are actually in your system at the minute, you know, where you're looking at them from a strategic point of view of going, okay, in 2 years down the line, there could be potentially a road realignment scheme or something happens in that area which might actually help impact upon parking. Is that something that's going to be included or looked at, or what discussions happen there in relation to that, which might streamline some of the process as well?
Yes, very much so. So at the moment, in relation to any major infrastructure projects, that is something that is looked at in terms of potential displacement and the impacts of parking pressures, not just in relation to residential areas, but more widely. We also are working through the transport plans. Those are also looking at areas and looking at those over the course of a number of years in relation to what we think parking pressures may look like as certain schemes and different policies are brought forward. And they will look at potentially where areas might be, but not necessarily determining specific streets in where residents' parking might be beneficial.
So in those cases, obviously this is very resource intensive because you have to go out and there's constant community engagement piece of work. So in those scenarios, are you going out to the community and actively saying, we are aware of a road project that could be potentially happening in X amount of months or years in this area, which could impact upon parking in your area?
Yes, and for anything that the department undertakes, there's always a significant level of engagement. Active travel is another good example of that in terms of projects and schemes that are being looked at, and then the implications that has more widely. I think for the residents' parking process that we are envisaging, it's that ability then to help residents understand in those areas where there isn't necessarily demand that they may be impacted. But again, in terms of this process, the ballot may not necessarily reflect where that area might be in 4 or 5 years' time. But again, in terms of allocating resources, we very much need to ensure that there is consensus in relation to residents. We don't want to place this on residents, especially in areas where permits won't be free. There is a charge, and we need to be mindful of that. And one of the fundamental principles of the policy is that there is consensus, and that we don't force this upon areas that do not want it.
So just to be clear, in those scenarios where there may be a scheme that will come, does that automatically then knock it out of the system, or does it still have to go through the stage 1, stage 2, you know, just to,
yes,
you know,
of course. Sorry,
yeah.
just to cut across you. So for any schemes that have been identified either strategically by the department or through infrastructure projects, they will automatically go into stage 2.
Okay.
The residents of those areas will be balloted, and failure to obtain the necessary buy-in from that area, they will be knocked out. They won't progress any further.
So sorry again if I'm not getting this correct. So say for example you have a scheme that's, you know, going to have a road scheme or something that will help in that particular area. It will still go into stage 2. Members of the public, there'll still be a consultation. So technically then if 50 plus decide to go for a parking permit or a parking scheme in that area, that will continue through the process, even though the department may know that there's going to be a road scheme that will come. So is that not going to incur more cost for the department in the meantime? Because then once it gets to the 5 years, do you know where I'm going with this?
Sorry, I was looking at it from the other
once it gets to the 5 years, then you could have a scenario where the department has spent money creating a road scheme, but has also spent money creating parking permits in place. So it just seems a bit
Yes, sorry, I was
Yeah.
thinking of it the other way, that people were not necessarily realising the impact that something might have
Yeah.
in their area. No, 100%. And that is why, you know, the process that we are proposing will look at all of this holistically, you know, being able to look at the impact of potential schemes going forward, and also looking at, you know, while certain areas may need intervention now, there will be other areas in the future, and how then these all link up. It's quite a complicated puzzle for us to work around in relation to, you know, addressing those issues. I think a really good example is the Ivey area of Belfast, where we know that there is parking pressures, the changes at Royal Victoria Hospital and their parking, and we know that there will be pressures mounting in that area. So it's being mindful not just of departmental projects, but also mindful of other policies, you know, across other departments, and the impact that might have on areas going forward.
Okay, and then can I just check in relation to the department, in the evidence that we've received, it references strategically identified schemes under stage 2. What strategic schemes have been identified to date, and by whom?
So potential schemes glider is an example, where it was identified the impact that glider might have in certain areas. The expansion of McGee campus up in Derry, Londonderry, that was also identified as an area that the department would need to consider. The same in relation to Ulster University Belfast campus. So those are schemes that the department has already identified and committed to looking at. So those are the sort of examples of the types of schemes that we would be considering.
Okay. And then what role, if any, do local councils play in highlighting potentially those strategic schemes, and even, I suppose, other schemes as well?
So as well as, you know, the engagement in relation to the scheme or the project, separately for residents parking, at the moment there is engagement with local councils. They're one of the key stakeholders to ensure that anything that we are looking at as a department or proposing doesn't impact on anything that they're considering or taking forward. So that's already built into the process at the moment. And then we're looking at building on that in this new process to have earlier engagement before we progress into those more resource intensive steps in the policy process.
Okay, and can I just double check before I go to other members, can I just double check your actual numbers in terms of resourcing in the team at this moment in time? Because I know the last time that we had officials up to brief us, they said that there would be a new team in place in a matter of weeks. So can I just check in terms of resourcing, because it is a huge amount of work that needs to be done in relation to this. So if you wouldn't mind giving me some updated figures on that.
Yes, of course. Well, we are the small Bijou parking policy team, myself and Mark, and we have 2 other members within the team. But I think it's important to stress that whilst we are looking after the policy and the policy development and changes to the process, there are also other divisions within the department that will be responsible for taking this work forward. So we will be heavily reliant on the roads divisions within the department in terms of sort of that design, implementation. We also then have parking enforcement colleagues who currently look after the residents' parking permit process, the enforcement. So whilst we may be the policy team, there are an awful lot of other individuals involved in this.
Okay, thank you. I don't relish the task, but I'm going to move to other members. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, folks, for the presentation and the update from what you folks were in last in January. I suppose just to say at the outset, you know, I do think it is disappointing that we still only have one really active scheme, Rugby Road, you know, in over 18 years. You know, and there has been frustration around that, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's been long talked about in the Assembly for 15 years, different areas. So hopefully this can kickstart things a bit more, you know, and I do welcome the streamlined approach. So I suppose just to say, picking up on what the Chair had mentioned, was one of my points was, you know, given the resource challenges that you have, you know, how confident are you that you do have them in place to really get these moving, you know, and rolled out across Northern Ireland?
From the department's perspective, whilst resource will be a fundamental challenge going forward, especially in terms of how many schemes progress through the stages, I think, the main challenge will be the buy-in and securing that level of buy-in from residents to allow schemes to progress. So it's being able to meet those different stages within the proposed process, and then allocating and prioritising resources based on those schemes. So scheme costs will differ depending on the size of the scheme, the complexities of the scheme, where those schemes may be in terms of how they link up with our enforcement areas at the moment. So there's quite a few factors that we need to consider.
Yeah, obviously working with your own local engineers, who do have a great knowledge of, certainly within my area, of the issues that do exist, and certainly Bangor and Hollywood would be two that in my constituency that we've pushed for many years, and residents are keen to see them. But I suppose I'm just keen to know the role of businesses as well, what the role they would have in any consultation, because I know that has been a factor in some parts of Belfast as well in the past.
Businesses have the opportunity to respond the same as a resident. So a resident and a business are considered, on an equal footing in relation to the ballot process. So they have a vote as much as a resident has a vote in relation to responses to the department. There's a lot of engagement, and has been a lot of engagement in the past with businesses, especially due to parking issues that they may face. There's flexibility within the current policy and guidance to recognise not just the likes of specific businesses but churches and schools in terms of considerations that need to be made, and ensuring that whatever sort of parking restrictions are put in place recognise access and the need for access to businesses, whether these be churches or schools or mechanics is a really good example as well. So they have the opportunity to respond, and their response is just as valued as a resident's response. And then there's an opportunity throughout the process, right through to formal consultation, to then put forward any objections that they may have for the scheme.
Okay, that's interesting, and obviously there is differences. The demands in parking Monday to Friday can be different then from what Sunday is, for example. So I presume there is flexibility, or is it 7 days a week?
No, not at all. So there is flexibility. So parking restrictions would be put in place to reflect the parking pressures in that area, and I think that's where the complexity lies in delivering these schemes.
Yeah.
Each area is specific, which has specific issues, and it's making sure that we're putting in restrictions that address the parking pressures at whatever time that may be, and not applying a blanket restriction which then causes issues in relation to parking outside certain hours.
Yeah. Okay, just final point then, is there any update on sort of time frames for the application process going live, do you feel, at this stage?
At the moment, Minister is currently considering our proposals, and the feedback that we received today will also be used to inform that decision. We'd be hopeful in the coming months, but again, I couldn't commit to that until obviously we've received the feedback and we've worked through that within the department.
Okay, thanks folks, thanks Chair.
Thank you. Cahill?
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks very much. You're very welcome. Just trying to get my head around it. So I take it it's not a one-size-fits-all. So, having said that, so how confident then are you in the process? And just to follow up in relation to that, I mean, you've talked there about being proactive in terms of the new schemes, but I want to go back to the reactionary stuff in terms of requests, in terms of percentages. I mean, where are we with that? I mean, obviously they've been requests down through the years for certain schemes and haven't gone ahead.
Yes.
But that, just those are my first two remarks, if you want to respond.
Yeah, so in terms of the buy-in, we think that's a fundamental problem, and we had reduced the buy-in a few years ago, 2017, and we lowered it, and we had one of the lowest thresholds across England, Scotland and Wales in the south, in a hope and a bid that we would be able to get more schemes up and running.
but actually in having such a low threshold, it meant that there wasn't the buy-in in residential areas. So a lot of time and resource was going in to developing and designing schemes, which were ultimately never getting the necessary buy-in from residents in the first place. In terms of confidence in the process, it is very much a case that we are proposing over 50%. If we find it's not working, or that, you know, we're failing to garner that level of response rate or interest in the schemes, then we will of course revisit that. Nothing will be set in stone. We want to make sure that we're reactive to how this process starts to embed and goes forward.
But that's the threshold you're going with at the minute. Obviously, time will
That
tell.
is our proposed
Yeah,
threshold.
no, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Chair. Just make sure that's recorded properly. Proposed. No, I mean, because it's keen. I mean, obviously it'll fit. You know, we need to make sure the issues are dealt with properly and given an opportunity. See, in terms of the review process, when do you propose to carry that out? And you know, it has to be cost effective and fit for purpose. Let's be honest. So, just you'd like to comment around that. How do you see that process working out?
It's probably dependent on how many schemes we're able to roll out and implement. We need to be given enough time to see it embed in an area similar to Rugby Road, and to see how sort of the costs associated with that area are over a certain period of time. So for example, in relation to Rugby Road, you know, the first year of rollout there were an awful lot of PCNs issued while people started to get used to the process. That potentially gives an unfair sort of indication that there's, you know, the income being allocated from that is something that will be sustained, and it won't be. So we have sort of proposed a periodic review process, not committing ourselves to 4 years or 5 years. It will be very much dependent on, you know, resources within the department, and then also then how many schemes currently need to be looked at, and again representations either from members of the residents in that area or councillors or MLAs if they have concerns, that we have the ability to look at that sooner rather than later.
Okay, and my final question, Chair. Say if a scheme's not deemed appropriate, I mean, you're still going to get the issues of councillors going to be contacted, MLAs, and you're still going to have those ongoing problems. Have you given any thought, other than the PCNs or whatever measure it is? I mean, have you given any thought to that going forward, how we address that? Because that's still going to be an issue for us.
Yes.
I mean, so as part of the new processes, have you thought about that?
In terms of looking at areas for residents parking, we as a department always look at other measures we could potentially implement, such as double yellow lines, waiting restrictions, all that sort of stuff. So residents parking is one of the tools sort of in our toolbox that we can use. We would need the evidence to support the need to take a residents parking scheme away, and that evidence and the surveys would be very much then be able to indicate what the issue actually is and what issues we may be able to address. I want to make it very clear that it's not something that we would do lightly. You know, it would be very much evidence-based with significant levels of engagement before a decision was made to potentially remove a scheme in an area.
Right, and just final, Chair, because some of you, just sorry, sir.
Never say final.
Sorry, final. That's Keith Buchanan's words. Final. You see, is there? Say if there's a new scheme and you know that, say you mentioned it later, so it's going to have a serious impact. And how does that work in terms of, are you going to impose the scheme, or how does it work? I mean, you know, the whole idea of that is you're flagging it up because the laters coming in is going to cause major problems. So it's not like, I'm not saying it's a vetting process, but what I'm saying is, how do you look at that? It's still going to be part of this process, and hopefully it'll be, you know, it'll be down to residents to agree.
Yes, and it will, and that's a fundamental premise of the current policy. It's consensus and it's majority. and we would not impose a scheme, because it's not a case of putting in place waiting restrictions. There are potentially cost implications for residents, and we need to be mindful of that, and that's why consensus is so important.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Phil.
Consensus is key in everything.
No,
Thank you,
yeah, very
Cathal.
good.
Mark's online.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to Laura and Mark for coming along and for an update on this issue. I think what it is clear is that there's no simple fix to a lot of the issues facing residential communities, and when we herald progress of sorts in terms of residents parking, people living with the problems of commuter parking on their doorstep are probably a long way from seeing the benefits of that progress. In terms of the I suppose balloting or consultation with residents, and the 50 plus of residents balloted, not of respondents, required to progress a scheme, they'll be reconsulted then, I imagine, when the scheme is designed, or is it just you've said yes and this is what you're getting, or is there scope for them then in I know different areas will have different challenges, but they actually be provided with options of schemes or things like that, and at that stage are 100% of residents reconsulted, or just the 50 plus who've responded positively?
Thank you, Mark. In terms of consultation and engagement, we're proposing to introduce it in every stage of the process. So in terms of balloting residents, all residents in that area will be balloted. In terms of the department's proposed design, which will be very much based on evidence and sort of the infrastructure of that area and what it can support, we are proposing that we go out again to ballot residents on that design. What we have fallen down on in the past is constantly redesigning a scheme to try and address concerns of residents and businesses in certain areas. And this has sort of led to this perpetual cycle of redesigning, and whilst pleasing some residents and businesses, we then find that we're displeasing others. So I think looking at best practice elsewhere, especially in Dublin, we are proposing that we develop a scheme design, we put it out to ballot, and that is the scheme design based on our work, our surveys, in relation to what an area can support in relation to residents parking, and then again feedback on that and reaching that sort of 50% response rate to then go to formal consultation on scheme design. Now, we have built in the ability to reconsider scheme designs if there are fundamental issues that need to be addressed. For example, the need for more disabled parking bays, that if situations in certain areas change, that, the likes of coach parking or loading and unloading needs to be reconsidered. That's the sort of things that we will very much reconsider the scheme design for. But what we are trying to stop is this perpetual cycle of redesigning to try and gain that consensus, which we've really struggled to get in certain areas.
Yeah, it's going to mean more and more work for you, and I know a question has been asked around your resourcing, but I'm also acutely aware of resource challenges faced by your colleagues in traffic across the local division offices, who will obviously, through their time in these locales, already have an acute awareness of issues there, and hopefully be well placed to propose, maybe in the absence of a residence parking scheme, those alternative tools at your disposal. Now, Cathal says that it's not one size fits all, and I've alluded to that too, but I think of one of the schemes you have mentioned, one of the strategic ones, and that in and around the Derry University area, and an area that I know well. I think that will be particularly complex given the different, even in that small area, the different streetscapes and styles, where you've driveways in some streets and not in others. You've different topography. You've other things going on in around there. And it's because you've named this scheme as one that is being prioritised, dare I say, it'll almost require a few different schemes.
In terms of a number of residence parking schemes, yes,
Yes,
rather than
because
something
of the different challenges. They aren't all streets of terraced houses. You know, you've detached houses with driveways, you've semi-detached where some have driveways and some don't, and then you have the terraced houses. So the different streets will have different difficulties, but they all do have difficulties. And it won't be a case of what works for someone in Aberfoyle Crescent won't work for someone in Argyle Street. It's going to be a very difficult one that you're prioritising, and will be very labour intensive, one would imagine, but very important that it progresses.
Yes, and there's a lot of engagement, especially with our roads colleagues in that area, in terms of with residents in different areas, and looking at what streets and what areas could be captured within a residence parking scheme up there. Very different streets, very different types of issues to be addressed, but the fundamental principles of the residence parking scheme will be, you know, we will prioritise where individuals do not have access to off-street parking, and where they are struggling due to either commuter parking or nuisance parking, the ability to park in close proximity to their residents.
And finally, Chair, HMOs are an issue in and around universities in particular. I think in planning terms now, well, Derry City Council and their local development plan have determined that any HMO over 4 bedrooms won't be allowed. But for a 4-bed house, I think the given for DFI is that it will have 2.4 cars. How will HMOs figure in terms of the balloting or consideration of progression of these schemes? Will they be just counted as that ordinary home with 2.4 cars, when in fact they could have more due to the fact there's 4 adults, as there could be in any house living with vehicles?
Yes, in terms of an HMO, currently the current process is that if it's one rateable household, then there will be one vote for that HMO. So regardless of how many individuals are living in that residence, they have one vote in relation to the ballots. In terms of workable schemes and how we consider sort of areas and streets, we don't necessarily work on the basis of how many vehicles are linked to a household. Whilst we do request that information, we look more in terms of how many parking spaces can we facilitate in that area to address each resident with 1.2 spaces. So we would work on the basis that it would be 1 permit for everyone who doesn't have off-street parking available to them, and then depending on the scale and the size of the area, then we allocate additional permits, but it's 1 permit per household in relation to those who don't have off-street parking.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everyone, for coming in today. I was just wondering, the way I sort of connect with the residence parking schemes is going to Rugby Road in South Belfast. I go quite regularly. I think it's been really successful in terms of getting access to parking, and certainly I haven't had many complaints come through from colleagues as well on that. So I'm just wondering, do you have a figure that you can put on how much it costs to roughly explore a residence parking scheme? Stephen's alluded already to 305 already being in the system, but if one goes into the system, what does it tangibly look like in terms of, you know, the amount of hours that are put in by a staff member to call out to do the research and the report as to what a scheme could look like there? I mean, do you have a figure or sort of hours that it would take? Because that 305 from 2007 is huge.
Yeah.
given that we've only returned Rugby Road. So can you explain to us how that actually impacts upon I would say, under-resourced department? But in terms of finance hours, can you maybe let us know a bit more information about that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
It's probably the best answer. So in terms of our proposed process and bringing forward sort of stage 1 and stage 2, the one of the principal ideas behind that was to reduce that resource intensive nature from that design stage going forward. So in terms of our ability to sift through applications and being able to do that, you know, we believe that we have the resources to be able to do that. We cannot determine with any great certainty the impact may have on timings, because the more applications that we have, the greater time frame it will take us to work through it, because what we want to be able to do is to look up all the requests holistically in case there are areas that have individuals have asked for similar schemes in similar areas. In relation to the costs associated with Rugby Road, really those are the only real costs that we have in terms of sort of design and implementation. The review highlighted the costs associated with the scheme, but looking at it now, if we were to deliver a similar scheme to Rugby Road, which again heavily caveated with each scheme will look different, you'd be looking at approximately £300,000.
And have you any figures in terms of the money that's brought back in with people having to pay money to park there sort of annually? What would that be looking like?
I actually do, because we got it hot off the
brilliant.
press this morning.
Brilliant.
Just in time.
Just in time. So I'm going to go to that specifically to make sure that I get it right.
We're listening, Pete.
So for 24-25, in terms of income, we're just looking at over £126,000 for Rugby Road, College Park Avenue. So the majority of that income comes from pay and display. So £122,873 from pay and display. In relation to residence permits, now Rugby Road area, they do pay for permits, so it's £30 per permit on an annual basis for each permit for the residents. That's £3,360. And then for visitors permits, so individuals can then every quarter buy visitors permits. That gives them 25 permits to be used within the quarter. That was £737.50. And that's why I said over 126,000, because we didn't have the time to do the maths to add it all up.
All right, sorry. I'm not holding that against you.
Obviously,
So,
I'm not a
yeah, Laura.
mathematician, but in terms of paying off that £300,000, it takes about 2 years roughly. It sort of pays itself off.
Yes, and I think as well, because of the complexities of Rugby Road and it being really our sort of pilot scheme, the costs there are probably slightly higher than we would expect other schemes to be.
Okay. But obviously as well, just in terms of that money that is made, does that come back into the department, or does that go, like, where does that money go?
So that's used for sort of our enforcement services. So
It's
that
for enforcement?
Yeah.
Okay. And then just secondly, you've mentioned glider a couple of times. I take it you mean BRT2. And is there any learnings you can take as an East Belfast MLA from the experience in East to West Belfast? Any learnings that can be taken from that and applied across to BRT2?
I think that was one of the main findings in the review, that greater consideration needs to be given to the impact, of parking pressures in those areas. And very similar to what I said before, residence parking is one of the tools in the department's toolkits. So it's being mindful of that and being mindful as well of displacement that may be created depending on the sort of interventions that we take.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else on my list, but it was just to check something for myself. What was the buy-in percentage originally for the schemes?
So it worked out at roughly 22%.
Okay, and then obviously then it's larger now in this, and is a hope then that will just reduce the resource element of it, that you have the bigger buy-in from the get-go. Okay.
That's what we hope, Chair.
And then in terms of obviously the 5-year review, I just keep going back to the fact that you have, the 305 there, and the length of time that takes to get through the system. And I know when we looked last time at the likes of Rugby Road and places like that, and it was a long period of time before those schemes actually got rolled out. So in terms of a review, how confident would you be that you would actually be able to go back and review them after 5 years? Will that take another team there to do that? Because you're still going to have quite a lot in your system still. I'm only surmising that. So, the resource element there of having to go back and review, and why 5 years was chosen as a number, I suppose.
Yeah. The 5-year rule or proposal is based on the ability of residents to come and ask the department to reconsider a scheme again in relation to the departmental review of schemes that we implement. We are being a bit more using the terminology periodically, because we need to really understand as this progresses what the resource implications will be before we sort of say definitively whether we need, after so many years, to go in and review a scheme. And again, it'll very much likely be on a case-by-case basis, but built on the principles of why we would go in to reconsider whether a scheme is viable or not.
Okay. Keith, I see your hands up there. Keith? Keith is frozen in time.
That's going to be recorded forever, Chair.
I know. Keith? Oh dear.
It doesn't see the.
I'll just. Keith, you can't hear us. I take it he's gone. We'll maybe get Keith's questions if you're content with that, and maybe forward them on to yourselves if you're happy enough with that. I don't think there was anything else that members had. All content? Well, look, thank you for your time. As I said, unfortunately, Keith, his internet has obviously dropped out, but look, we'll get Keith's questions and we'll get them sent over just for a response, if that's okay.
Yes, no problem.
Super.
Any feedback following this, Chair and members, we're happy to take.
It'll be a bit mid-Ulster, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, everybody. Just on the back of that, is there any feedback just that you want to send back to the department, obviously, to inform the decision making around the schemes, or anything else that anybody wants to check up on? You're content? Okay. Look, I'm just proposing that we take, it is quite warm in here today, I'm just proposing that we take a 5-minute break, and if we could come back 11:15 sharp, and then we'll start into our fiscal council briefing, if that's okay. So I adjourn the meeting for now. Thank you.
Committee Room 29, Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Committee Room 29, Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, folks. Keith, you're back online with us again. Because of broadband issues there, you mightn't just have heard, but if you could send in your questions, please, to the clerks, and we'll get them raised as correspondence just in relation to the last item, if you're happy enough with that.
Yeah, it wasn't nothing major. That's fine. I'll do that. It's only 1 or 2 lines. I'll ping it through. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, Keith, but if you could do that, that would be good. Thank you. Okay, we're now moving on to the report on the financial sustainability of water delivery services in Northern Ireland, and this is the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council with oral evidence today. At page 156, you'll see the clerk's memo. At page 158, you'll see the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council Sustainability Report 25, a special focus on water. At page 206, you'll see charts and tables, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council Sustainability Report 2025. And at page 239, you'll see the press release, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council Sustainability Report 2025. So members, all witnesses today will be attending remotely. So if you can keep your eyes on the screen, obviously, and if there is a question directed to somebody, if you could pinpoint that whenever you're directing your questions. So I think we'll have them on screen.
They are.
Yeah.
They can hear us. Yeah.
I just want to check that they can hear us okay. Hopefully they can. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So we welcome Robert Choate, Chairperson, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, Jonathan Adams, Chief of Staff, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. We have Professor Alan Barrett, Council Member, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, and Maureen O'Reilly, Council Member, Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. You're very, very welcome to the committee today. I have been reading avidly your report, and it was a pleasure. Some of us from the Infrastructure Committee were there last week in person for the briefing that you did at Ulster University, and we want to thank you for your work on it. So obviously we have an extensive report that is in front of us, and if you don't mind, if you could just briefly outline for 5 minutes, which I know could be quite difficult to do, but if you could for about 5 minutes detail and introduce the report, and then I'm keen to come to members' questions in relation to it. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chair, for the invitation. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, Robert.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as let me take you briefly through the highlights. As you know, Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK in which water and sewerage industry remains in public ownership. Northern Ireland Water itself was created towards the end of the period of direct rule in 2007. And at the same time that it was created, the UK government was intending to introduce domestic and non-domestic water charges. But they decided in the end to leave the decision on domestic water charges to the incoming executive. The incoming executive then decided to defer the introduction of domestic water charges, and they have remained deferred ever since. And so as a result, instead of the money that would come from domestic water charges, the Department for Infrastructure pays an equivalent amount in subsidy, and that accounts for about 70% of the income or the financing of NI Water. One complexity when you are looking at the finances of NI Water is there are 2 lenses you can look at it through. One, the way that they appear in standard corporate accounts, reflecting the fact that it is what's called a government-owned company, or GoCo. But equally as important, it's accounted for in the way in which the Treasury manages public expenditure and therefore requires the executive to do so by having essentially budget cover or expenditure limits for both resource and capital, and the spending in its current form as a non-departmental public body, the spending of NI Water counts towards the Department for Infrastructure's budget cover and therefore to the executive as a whole. So it's competing with all the other pressures for public services financing elsewhere across the executive. The key takeaway from this is that in terms of what NI Water can spend in practice, it's not the cash it has available to it and its ability to borrow to bring more in. It's this amount of budget cover, the amount of the expenditure limit of the department that NI Water has access to. So the fact, for example, that in its accounts, NI Water makes a profit and pays a dividend is not suggesting that there is automatically money there that could be spent on services. Other key thing to bear in mind about NI Water is that it is a natural monopoly, so you can't have lots of competing providers of domestic water and sewerage services. So as a result, it is regulated by the utility regulator to protect consumers. And so the regulator will set out targets that NI Water has to achieve, efficiency it has to achieve, what profit it can make, effectively speaking, and also indicates the amount of budget cover that it thinks that NI Water needs to fulfil its statutory and regulatory obligations. Now, that means that in a sense, you can think about the adequacy of funding for NI Water in 2 ways. Does it get the money that the utility regulator thinks it needs in order to fulfill the regulatory requirements? And then more broadly, are those requirements set in such a way that will serve the public good, for example, by providing enough investment in infrastructure? The first point to make on that is that there is no guarantee that NI Water does receive all the money that the regulator thinks is necessary. And if you look at recent history, there have been years in which essentially DFI has said, I'm afraid there's not enough money to provide you with that amount, and therefore NI Water has to prioritise accordingly. If you look at the performance of NI Water, or rather as the way in which the contracts, what are called price controls between the regulator and NI Water, are set up. The first two of those, they run over multiple year periods, were really about trying to increase the relative efficiency of Northern Ireland Water relative to its English and Welsh counterparts, and that was quite successful. More recently, those price control contracts have focused more on longer term sustainability and have involved a big increase in potential investment. So there's been quite an improvement in the relative efficiency of Northern Ireland Water compared to other countries, compared to its English and Welsh counterparts. But one thing that is worth noting is that Ofwat, the regulator in England and Wales, has said that the water companies there need a lot more resource to invest over the next few years, and is basically sanctioned quite big above inflation increases in domestic and non-domestic charges for water consumers in those places. And because of the reliance on subsidy from the Department of Infrastructure, it would be very hard to provide that same flow of additional money for investment for NI Water. If you think then about the rationale for wanting to have greater investment and greater financial resources for NI Water, in addition to those services to customers, public health, environmental considerations, there's the long-standing belief that inadequate wastewater and sewerage infrastructure is a meaningful constraint on the ability to do residential and commercial development around Belfast and elsewhere, and that's holding back economic growth. So that's another reason why you think it might be desirable to get more resources into NI Water. Of the various options that are talked about in ways to do that, obviously the perennial one is domestic water charging. That, as I say, has been deferred, and it remains the view of current ministers is that is not a desirable thing. Obviously, it would be placing additional financial burdens upon households. DFI estimates that if you did have domestic water charging in 2022-23, it would probably freed up about £300 million of additional budget cover. NI Water says probably 450 or so if you look at more recent years. So clearly there would be that potential to bring more resourcing in. If you did have some additional domestic water charging while retaining government control, it's possible then that you would see NI Water moving from being a non-departmental public body to being a public corporation like TransLink. It's still then ultimately constrained by the budget cover that it can get from DFI and from the executive more broadly, although what scores towards that changes in a complicated way that we probably don't need to go into. It's less about what it spends than the capital financing and subsidy that it receives. If you were to move NI Water into the private sector, that would remove that need for budget cover, but obviously there would then be a greater potential to bring in more money from external borrowing, but certainly not without risk, and you don't need to look far at the English and Welsh companies to see how some of those risks manifest themselves. Other possibilities for bringing more money into NI Water would be simply to use existing budgetary mechanisms. You could increase the regional rate, for example, and use resources on that basis to bring more money into the executive and more money onto that area. That, of course, like domestic charging, would be an additional imposition on households, although it would fall in different ways. You could, as does occasionally happen, go to the Treasury and ask for more money from the UK government. I don't think under current circumstances, current fiscal position, the Treasury's concerns about what would be seen as being the relative treatment of different parts of the UK, that would be likely to be terribly successful. So I think the bottom line of all of this is, from a public policy point of view, the fundamental constraint on NI Water is a budgetary one, budget cover one. So even if NI Water had cash on hand or access to borrowing, it can't be spent unless it's got the budget cover within the Department for Infrastructure's budget to do so. And so you really do need to have some form of bringing in additional revenue to be able to spend here, rather than accounting sleight of hand. Now, clearly, any of those models would put, in all probability, a greater burden on households, but there are consequences for households if no action is taken in the quality of the services received and the scope for commercial and residential development, which would obviously be a benefit to households and also to the economy as a whole. So that was a bit of a canter through, but hopefully that's of help.
Thank you, Sir Choate. You did quite a canter through, but I think you covered all the main points as I was sort of flicking through some of the things that I have highlighted here in my document. I have been reading it quite avidly in the last week, looking through the things that you have discussed. So I'll kick off in terms of some of the questions. You may or may not have realised, obviously, your report did get some traction in the Assembly Chamber in the last week, and it was raised during finance questions this week, and I noted the Finance Minister's comments, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but he did sort of say that the report doesn't actually make any real recommendations in terms of what should be done. Would you dispute that? Because my reading of it is that you're asking the executive to implement domestic water charging.
Well, I think that for the role of the council, we're more about explaining the trade-offs and the choices that confront the executive rather than saying this is the one that you ought to take. So it's trying to clarify that position. So it's not explicitly saying there is no alternative to domestic water charging. It's essentially saying that if you are going to want to have greater investment in the water and sewerage sector in Northern Ireland, for which there appear to be good and compelling arguments, partly to match what might be happening in England and Wales, but also to deal with the local specific challenges on development, you've got to bring in more revenue. There are different ways in which you could do that. Those are ultimately choices for the executive and for the Assembly to make. Domestic water charging, the regional rate is the only really major tax lever that the executive has available to it. Obviously has fewer tax raising powers than, for example, the other devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. So those are their choices. The alternative is do nothing and look at the way in which development will be likely to be constrained and the potential consequences for environmental, public health, performance, etc. So those are the choices that, in a sense, that confront the executive. There will be other ones that well at the margin. So I think our role is really to sort of say these are the things you have to choose between and decide about, rather than for us to say this is how you ought to make those ultimately political choices. But colleagues may want to expand on that.
Thank you. I just wanted to check in terms of, on page 31, it talked about some of the stakeholders that you have been involved in, and they were from business community, local councils, political parties, civil service, public bodies. Can you maybe provide a brief sort of breakdown in terms of the amount of people that you engaged with during this process and how long it took for the Fiscal Council to look at this issue and report back on it as well?
Well, it has certainly taken quite a long time, and that's partly because I don't think we realised quite how complicated, in particular, the different financial lenses through which you have to look at NI Water, the complexities of how different sorts of public body are treated under the Treasury's accounting public expenditure control rules. So lots of conversations, obviously with the department, with NI Water, with the regulator, talking to the Treasury about whether we got the correct understanding of how the expenditure rules work. Speaking in terms of the sort of external business community stakeholders, obviously quite a few of those, not merely in the preparation of this report, but pretty much, most conversations I've had since taking on this role, even when we've not been doing this report. You don't have to wait long before issues like domestic water charging come up. So the issue, I think, of the need for greater investment in order to improve infrastructure, to bring about a better environment for development, commercial and residential development, has been a consistent theme that's come back.
And just to check, in terms of the departments here, what level of engagement took place with any of the departments per se here in collating the report?
I might ask Jonathan to come in a minute. I mean, we have had very good, obviously, with this, NI Water itself, the Department for Infrastructure, the utility regulator are the key players in the price control regulatory and funding process. And then, as I say, you obviously also have the Treasury setting the rules around that. So we've had useful and productive conversations with all of those, and they've been very patient in coming back when we say we don't quite understand this. Can you help clarify that? Jonathan, is there anything you want to add on that engagement?
Yes, just to flag in terms of the level of engagement we have terms of reference with each of the different departments, and it's usually at finance director level that we would engage the departments. And as Robert says, it's infrastructure and finance are the two that we've had the most engagement with over the last probably 18 months that we've been working on this report. And as well as the report itself or sections of it, there are a number of occasions where we've gone to them with some quite extensive information requests, which they've been very helpful. As Robert says, the relationship there is very constructive. We've also shared some sort of shorter technical papers on aspects of this, like that issue about what if it was changed to a public corporation rather than an NDPB. So over the last 18 months, there's been quite extensive relationships and information requests, especially of infrastructure and the Department of Finance, as well as departments in Whitehall like Treasury on certain matters of expertise.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I was interested in relation to, you talked about an infrastructure levy in your report, and I'm interested to know how you think that could, I suppose, potentially work in practice, because an infrastructure levy can mean an awful lot of things, and you talk about the competing nature of budgets and in-year monitoring rounds and things like that, and really NI Water is competing up against road maintenance and a whole lot of other things. So in terms of an infrastructure levy, how do you envisage that would actually in practice work? Because it would clearly need to be ring-fenced for NI Water for it to actually give the revenue that it needs to have from a departmental point of view.
Well, I think the first point is just to echo what you said. Obviously, different people will mean different things by infrastructure levy. So are you essentially talking about an increase in the regional rate that is badged as being something either domestic or non-domestic that would be move in this direction? There's also, of course, some people would think about the contributions that developers would make when there are existing contributions when new work happens for access to infrastructure. Might you want to do more on that basis? So there are different models for different versions of this. Jonathan, again, I don't know whether there's anything you want to expand on that, but it's essentially one important differentiation is if you're thinking about things that are just an additional imposition or a contribution when you've got some new development coming along, is that going to generate the sorts of amounts of money that NI Water and others have been talking about as the need, for example, for above average expenditure over an 18-year period if you're really going to deal with the backlog of development constraints, rather than something that is essentially a broader charge but clearly badged in that direction. But Jonathan might be able to expand.
There's one technical aspect to an infrastructure levy that I just want to flag, which is that we talked earlier a little bit about whether the corporate model is important. And if the infrastructure levy was collected as part of general taxation, say by the department or by the executive, and provided, as you say, like a ring-fenced addition to the subsidy, that wouldn't be probably very unlikely to be treated as sales by the ONS. What that means is that that Northern Ireland Water, even if it was now receiving enough money to cover more than 50% of its costs, it wouldn't pass the market test, which would mean that it couldn't move from being an NDPB to a public corporation. As we said, there are pros and cons with both of those models, but an infrastructure levy would probably constrain it to remain as an NDPB. I see Alan wants to jump in, so I'll be quiet.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Jonathan. Just a very quick point on development levies. I mean, often politicians are attracted to development levies because it's the idea that you're putting the burden on business as opposed to households. And again, we all understand that, you know, people want to avoid the putting of the burdens on households. But always be aware that it's always perfectly possible that development levies merely get added to the price of housing. Okay, whereby ultimately households are actually paying the development levy, and so they are paying for this. So while I understand the attractiveness, it really comes back to that point. And again, I was struck there by your question on recommendations. I mean, I think, as Robert sort of clearly pointed out, we don't make recommendations, but I think what the report is rather good at is sort of pointing out what aren't real solutions here. That I think when we started this, and certainly from my perspective, I would have been sort of persuaded that maybe there were corporate structures, a way of doing this that would have sort of freed the budgetary envelope to a certain degree. But you know, it appears not to be the case, and you do come back to that issue again of charging somebody. But I just want to add to that point on the incidence of development levies is that ultimately it could be the homeowners.
Thank you, Alan. Jonathan. It's an interesting point, particularly when we will be looking at the developer-led contribution model, I suppose, or policy that the Minister is bringing forward, and obviously we're waiting at the minute for the outworkings of the consultation that was there. So I suppose it's an interesting point to bear in mind. Just moving on, because I don't want to take up too much time, and I know that other members are looking in on questions. Just on page 32, I was also struck by when you're looking at development constraints of areas, and obviously the Northern Ireland Audit Office, they made mention to the fact that some have questioned the extent to which restrictions are being applied are entirely merited and do not feel they are presented with appropriate evidence by NI Water to justify the restrictions currently applied. And I know it was sort of indicated that maybe this is a tactic in terms of executive and budget setting process, and just wondering from the Fiscal Council point of view, did you see any sort of evidence that would point to that?
No, I mean, we felt that it was an interesting point that the NIAO had thought it worth mentioning in their report, and therefore I think we felt it was, we'd flagged it. We hadn't spoken, but then I think we weren't searching in that particular area for much more evidence on that front. Again, I'll yield to people with greater local knowledge, but we noted it because essentially the NI Audit Office had felt that it was worth pointing out. We didn't hear a great deal about that in detail in the from the stakeholders that we spoke to, but it was, you know, one issue that seemed worth flagging. I think in general, you speak to a wide range of different sort of stakeholders from councils and businesses, and the idea that there is what is in a widespread way seen as being a constraint on potentially economically valuable and valuable to people and to businesses, constraints seem to be widely held. So that concern the NIAO flagged, I don't think undermines the overall sense that there is a concern here that needs to be addressed. But again, I'm happy to yield to anybody who has heard more in that area.
Anybody want to add to that? No? Okay. And then lastly from me at this stage, you did make mention to the setup costs and administration of introducing domestic water charges, and you said that could be significant. Did you do any modelling in relation to what those costs might look like? Should the executive look towards that?
No, we didn't do anything further other than noting, and there's the Scottish experience. Obviously, it would depend in part on how you implemented charging if you were going to go down that route. If you're having metering, there's obviously issues around the need for metering, but you don't have to do it on that basis if you're doing something that's a charge based more on the property rather than the consumption of water. If you didn't do metering, you probably still have costs involved in ensuring that you're collecting and that you're dealing with debts as well. So it would depend exactly on how you did it. But no, we didn't go into a detailed examination of the different options around that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move now to Cahill Boylan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for presenting in front of us today. I'm sorry I didn't get the opportunity to come and chat to us, but maybe I'll take that offer up again at some point. Robert, I just want to start off because everybody thinks that the domestic water charge is going to be the panacea to all, to cure all ills, which it's not. I mean, we've seen the likes of Thames Water and Wales Water and what the challenges they have faced. So my point really to you, because your report is gauging towards bridging the gap in funding rather than to looking at an actual model. And there may not be a model. I don't know. I'm going to ask you just in terms of as part of your findings or as part of the conversation, is there a model out there other than outside the domestic water charge, or have you seen anything out there that could be introduced?
There are different models in different places. I think, as I say, effectively a choice between a domestic water charge and essentially, the other obvious one would be a supplement to the regional rate. It depends a bit on what sort of incentives you're trying to send people. Are you basically looking for something that looks at a way of raising money in a relatively efficient way across different households? Are you looking at something that's actually also going to change the way in which people consume more or less efficiently water as well? So there are different ways of doing this that are not just about how much money you can raise, but also what sort of behavioural changes that you're trying to get as well. So, and of course, if you look at and Alan will know much more about this, the Republic looked at an excess use charge, which was considered, which would have not had many people paying a water charge, but there would have been one for, I think, consumption depending on size of household and above that sort of limit, but then the government there decided not to proceed with that. So that would be another example of a model that was at least thought about, if not actually tried. But Alan, I don't know whether you want to say anything about other models.
Well, let me just come back to Member Boylan's introductory remarks. So, like the starting point was this idea that charging doesn't necessarily guarantee you an efficient and a sensible model, and of course that's absolutely true. But I think the flip side of that also applies in that it's hard to see efficient models that don't have charging. Okay, so I guess it's a what is that? It's a necessary condition, but necessarily a sufficient condition. And certainly, I mean, again, you'll all understand this. Still scarred by the sort of the discussions and debates that happened in the Republic about 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more than that. But the issue of conservation is really very, very important. I mean, one of the reasons that we sort of struggle on water is levels of wastage are pretty enormous in circumstances where people face no incentive whatsoever to conserve. So part of the rationale in the South, I mean, ultimately this was at the really bad time, and so the rationale for the charge was more about making money. But there was quite a coalition. Well, there was a big coalition against water charges. There was a coalition in favour, which was really all about the sensible management of a critical resource, which is water. So, as Robert said, and again, people may be familiar with this, there was a sort of a whole series of amended structures and tweaks to the proposed structure of charging and everything like that. And what was eventually arrived at was a system whereby you would have to have a truly enormous amount of water usage before you were paying any charge. So it really was one of those sort of political fudges ultimately that got us nowhere. But I just would sort of put back on the agenda this idea that with any utility, you can imagine yourself, when you simply give away the product, it's very, very hard then to manage the product. And it's almost certainly the case then that capacity requirements are much larger because of the absence of charging. And again, let me also be very clear. I know it's very easy for people like myself, Robert and Maureen, to say that. I do understand your dilemma as politicians.
No, appreciate it, Alan. Thanks for the honesty in that, because I mean, no matter what model it is, there's going to be problems and challenges anyway, and you've answered that. The other 2 points I want to make clearly, and I want to talk about the rates, because clearly people for years have paid within the rates we've never ever got a figure of what we've paid exactly, but on average it's £1,239 at the minute. The Minister said in the Chamber the other day the average water bill would be something like £590, roughly 50% on the average household bill. I mean, there's no way, going by what you're saying, and if people are reading from the report, that's exactly what's coming out of the report, that you'd put that roughly on ordinary households, which wouldn't be, certainly wouldn't be acceptable from can we speak from ourselves in terms of Sinn Féin, introducing that burden on families, because ultimately, Robert, you talked about the economy. That would have a serious impact on the economy as well, on whether people could reach those targets, or you know what I mean.
Could I perhaps come in there, Cathal? Just to say that one of the narratives has been that put out that we are already paying for water charges, but in effect we are actually currently, on the figure that you just provided, it's around 54% of the average of the rates that are in water charges are paid in England, Scotland and Wales. And even with the £590 payment per household that we discuss, that would take it up to around 80%. And I appreciate there are issues around disposable income and what that means in terms of disposable income for households. But, it is the case that we aren't paying that kind of contribution, and also that arguably that gap's arguably going to get wider, because, as Robert said earlier, there's going to be higher charges again, because of the issues with the water companies in England as well. So just to set some context around what we actually do pay as well.
I think the other point to make is that at the end of the, households are affected by this whether you do or you don't. So one of the consequences of not having domestic charging is that something, 300 million according to DFI a couple of years ago, 450 million over the second half of the current price control period according to NI Water, is essentially having to come out of the executive's budget that could be spent on something else. It could be spent on water, it could be spent on health provision, could be spent on education, a whole lot of other things. So because it is coming out of that block, the choice, which is a perfectly legitimate choice for politicians to make, is to say that we don't want to have this charge, but as a consequence, we're going to take it out of the pot of money from regional rates and the block grant that we have available to spend in all the other departments, communities, all the other things that one might want to care about, and that has consequences as well. So how households are already being affected in different ways by the fact that there are charges here. But as you rightly said, the 590 figure, just to be clear, is the utility regulator calculates essentially a sort of notional average charge for households, and so that's where that number comes from. Obviously, if you were to implement charging, one set of, I'm sure, discussions that you would then want to have is, within this system, do you want to be structuring the charges in such a way that protects less well-off households? That would obviously reduce the amount of money you're bringing in, but would be a perfectly legitimate thing for the executive to think about if it were ever to decide to go down that road. And obviously, I'm conscious at the moment that there's not much appetite for that.
Yeah, and it leads me on to my final point, Chair. It definitely is my final point. In terms of the utility regulator, because, I mean, for somebody who's been around here a long time and has seen all the price controls, and we've invested a lot of money over the last 17 or 18 years. The department was in last week and they're talking about an indicative allocation of 350 million, and the utility regulator is saying for this year 500 million, but then they're saying that 405 million can only be spent this year if it was given that amount. So my question is, it's reasonable to think that within the in-year allocation right across the board we could cover the gap of 50 million to cover that for the year. So that's what the Minister's looking at in terms of increased investment. So it's no different from reaching that target for the year. You know what I mean? So it's like you're talking about bridging the gap. There's an opportunity for this year, and I know we could get into multi-year budgets and everything else and more security, but I mean that's the reality of it in terms of what we're hearing for this year. But I don't know. Rather than just impose charges, there's an opportunity maybe this year for to secure that, because my point really is, when we asked the utility regulator who signed off on the PC, I mean, you know, do you find, I mean, they have a certain role, but is it marrying up with what NIW is putting there in terms of the development plan on the utility regulator's responsibilities? That's my question, probably.
Sure. I mean, there's a slightly complicated relationship between the regulator having essentially to come up with an answer, but they're obviously doing that in part on the basis of guidance around statutory guidance or guidance under statute that comes from the department, and also what NI Water is saying about business plans. And NI Water may, for example, say that if you gave them all the budget cover in the world, there's only so fast you can move with some of these things. In terms of what goes on in year, I think one, and this is another point that the Northern Ireland Audit Office picked up on, is that one of the challenges for NI Water is not merely that sometimes it doesn't get all the money in a particular year that the utility regulator thinks would be desirable, but that also sometimes when it does, or when it gets more money, it's basically handed out in the middle of the year because of the way in which the wider budget process is being managed. And that creates awkward incentives as well, because it's hard for NI Water to plan when they're still waiting at the sort of tail end of the year to know whether some additional money is going to come in or not. The Audit Office also noted that it creates this awkward incentive for NI Water to sort of be cautious and then to backload capital and other spending towards the end of the year as well. So the overall picture of there is no guarantee that they get all the money that utility regulator says that they ought to, and sometimes if it does come, it comes late in the year, and that's not the best basis to think about how to spend it most productively and most sensibly, when you know there's also then going to be a doubt about what's going to come along in the following year. But I don't know on the specific figures that you mentioned that were quoted most recently. Again, I go to colleagues. I don't know whether Jonathan or other would have any insights on that. I'm not fully cited on those particular numbers you quoted.
No, and the only thing I was just going to add was to build a little bit on what Robert said there about there's two different thresholds, if you like. There's the amount that they should get, and then sometimes the amount that they could get. So Northern Ireland Water said to us ourselves that that is a constraint. It's a real constraint as to how quickly they could build. So it's a little bit like the health service. If you threw an infinite amount of money at it, there are other constraints in the system about how quickly they could deliver those capital expansions. And Northern Ireland Water talk about an 18-year period of heightened investment in order to remove or to deal with the development constraints. The utility regulator didn't say to us explicitly whether or not they agreed with an 18-year period, but in general, the utility regulator agreed with the idea that there would need to be more investment over a long period in order to see radical change in terms of where the development constraints currently are.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. I'm now going to move to Andrew McMurray.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for presenting today and also presenting last week. It was really thought-provoking and a lot to get through. I suppose just one of the things that sort of struck me from the presentation last week, and I've sort of touched on a wee bit here already, was regarding the regional rate and the fact that the link between NI Water funding and the regional rate has been broken since 1998. And I was just wondering, can you just talk us through that in sort of a bit more detail, sort of and how did this happen and the implications for it happening? Because again, I suppose it comes back to the sort of the perception that we do pay for our water through the rate, but in the actuality we don't. But just if you could sort of talk us through that, that'd be useful for me anyway.
Yes, well, as you say, clearly the perception for a long period and quite widespread that there is already paying out of the rates has been a key part of the debate, and why moving in this direction has been more complicated than it otherwise would have done. So the formal break in 1998, essentially, I think this was when the executive was restored shortly after the creation of NI Water. they convene an independent water panel to do a study. And one of the questions that that panel was tasked with was to say, is it true, as often people say, that that we are actually already paying? The point they made was not only that the link was formally broken back in 1998, but because when it was broken, people didn't see their rates bill fall, it's not surprising that people didn't realise that that suddenly this was no longer there, and that there wasn't some pot of money that had suddenly become freed up because you had broken the link and you were no longer paying for water on that basis. Certainly, I think if you look at what the executive was saying shortly after that, they were implicitly saying that yes, it was partly paid for out of the rate. So I think it's a sort of semi-theological question. Formally, I don't think that link is there, but for an extended period of time, that argument has been made. Coming back to Maureen's point, though, if you actually look at the total amount that is paid in water charges plus council tax in England and Wales versus the regional rate is not much, is not vastly larger here, reflecting the fact that it's got the water charges implicitly in it as well. It is lower on average than in the other parts of the UK, but then of course so are incomes, house prices in the same way. So drawing that distinction clearly is not straightforward. But no, the formality of it, I think, is that if the independent panel was right, then is that the link was broken many years ago.
Thank you. Again, just reading the report. There's a lot of talk about loans and subsidies, and it's quite financially based. So I'm just trying to get my head around some of that. So the report states that the first DFI loan to NI Water is due to mature in 2027, and that Northern Ireland Water will have two options: refinancing the debt with new borrowing or a debt equity swap. I suppose, can you sort of further comment on the debt equity swap option, and how does this work with DFI being already the sole shareholder?
Yes, well, and the first point, as I say, to come back to is that obviously borrowing is a way of bringing more cash in, but fundamentally it's the budget cover and the way in which NI Water counts towards DFI's part of the departmental expenditure limit that is the determinant of what it can spend primarily. So changing, exactly how much money is flowing in from the loan notes is not going to change that crucial determinant of the scope to spend. So at the moment, as you say, essentially the NI Water could, in principle, borrow from the private sector if it wanted to, but there's not much point in doing so if you've essentially not got unspent budget cover to be able to use. So at the moment, it is partly by financing its investment by borrowing from DFI. DFI, as you rightly point out, is in this odd position. It's the sole shareholder of NI Water. It's the sole creditor. It's the largest source of income from subsidy. It's the second largest source of income because of the money that comes via DFI roads for runoff as well. So the thinking about it as a sort of conventional, like a private sector company borrowing to sort of spread its costs over time, it doesn't look quite in the same way. So the loans that it's got at the moment, they're not formally structured in a way that is requiring debt repayment, which is why in some people's minds do you think, well, is this actually really a sort of loan in a private sector way, or is it essentially another way of providing subsidy? So if you were to have a debt for equity swap, my understanding, and I will get into thin ice here in terms of my understanding, is that would increase the value of DFI's already 100% shareholding in NI Water. It would have consequences in the amount of money that is flowing back, but essentially NI Water and DFI are obviously both within the public sector, and so it's not bringing in additional resources in that way. Again, I yield to Jonathan or others if I've either misspoken or they think there's other things to add.
I might just add, just to go back to Robert's first point, that what we're talking about here is cash, and it doesn't really affect Northern Ireland Water's ability, its spending power, if you like, or the department's spending power. I'll come back with a caveat on that in a second. But effectively, if Northern Ireland Water borrows a lot of additional money, as Robert said, either from the banks or from the department, that's just cash that's sitting in its account, but it's not allowed to spend that cash. It's not allowed to move that cash outside of the public sector unless it's got the budget cover to do so. That's the thing that's constraining it at the moment. So to put it another way, handing that cash back to the department is not a detriment to Northern Ireland Water because they couldn't spend it anyway. So these are flows of cash, but they're both in the public sector. So if I'm in the public sector and my friends in the public sector and I give them a fiver and they give it back to me, the money hasn't left the public sector. It's if you like a little bit of a technicality, and that's the space that this is in. Now the caveat is that if the restructuring or the refinancing of the loans changes the level of charging that Northern Ireland Water raises on the non-domestic side, i.e. let's say for example it decreased the level of charge, that would mean that there would need to be more subsidy from the department to make up for the lower income. So that's the place where these start to get more than just technical, and the department will need to talk you through these because this is the limit of my knowledge as well. But where those different options like an equity swap or a restructuring the loan, refinancing the loan, where those change the rate of interest due, the utility regulator takes that into account, and if there was a lower rate of interest due, then the utility regulator would allow for lower charges on the non-domestic customers, and that might mean that more subsidy is required from the department. So that's where it's very technical, but that's where it gets different. There are differences between the two options.
No, thank you for that. Just going back to what Sir Robert said there, financing the investment through borrowing, does that mean that you're essentially borrowing money that we've already spent, or have I missed that, or have I taken that up wrong?
No, I mean it's another sort of cash flow from the department to NI Water. Some of it is coming in subsidy, some of it is being lent by NI Water, and that would obviously be more on the capital side than on the day-to-day resource spending side. There's also a flow of money into NI Water, as I say, via DFI roads to deal with runoff as well. So in senses, they're different ways in which money is flowing between the department and NI Water, and as we've said again, it's really the overall budget cover constraint and what NI Water can do within the DFI envelopes that matters. So if NI Water were to be investing more for a given DFI envelope, somebody else would have to be investing less. There's not additional constraint there.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Nicola Brogan is online, and I think you were looking in, Nicola, were you?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, we can hear you, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you folks for your presentation here this afternoon. It is very helpful. And I suppose really what it highlights is the issue that we all know is here, that NI Water has been underfunded, that I suppose British austerity for the last 15 years has been a contributing factor to that there. And it has had a significant impact, I suppose, on the economy, and as you mentioned, Robert, before, about our ability to build houses and that type of thing, which is affecting all of our areas. So we do need to have an approach to combat that. You'll know that the Infrastructure Minister, Liz Kimmins, has like a three-pronged approach to try and improve the wastewater infrastructure. So you'll know that she wanted to increase investment at executive level. There was talk about the developer contributions, which is out for consultation now, and then she wanted to introduce a bill to improve sustainable drainage systems. So Robert, you and I have spoken before. I was in the Finance Committee when we talked about the interim fiscal framework, and at that stage, Keith Archibald, as Finance Minister at the time, had secured the level of need for the North to be at 124%.
Sorry, Nicola, if you don't mind, I have a few people just looking in here. If you don't mind, if you could come to your questions. Sorry.
Yeah, surely. I want to make the point that, so Robert had mentioned that you know, maybe we shouldn't be seeking more kind of fund for that. But the most recent, the Hotham report most recently said that actually the level may be up to 132%. So I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that there, maybe how we could actually seek more funding for it. And I have two specific questions. Has the domestic water charges affected the performance of Thames Water and Wales Water? And is there any type of funding model that actually won't have its challenges and problems?
Well, let me pick those up. I think if you look at the English and Welsh situation, most recently, I mean, Ofwat has been pretty clear that it thinks that there needs to be more investment in the water companies in England and Wales. The Welsh Water, I mean, I think is pretty much in the same camp. We noted that obviously there are, for some reasons, obviously mutualisation looks more attractive in some respects than privatisation, given the sense that money would be flowing back and the business would be run in the interests of customers. The view of Ofwat is not that Welsh Water performs better, particularly than the privatised companies. Obviously, this is only one example, so drawing a clear relationship between that no mutual is going to perform better than a privatised entity, you wouldn't want to go that far, but there's no clear evidence on that basis. But the view that Ofwat has taken is that the English and Welsh companies essentially need to be able to increase their charges on both domestic and non-domestic customers by well above inflation for a 5-year period, principally to deliver on the environmental and public health requirements there. And there is no easy way to see the current structure and funding model for NI Water, how it could do that. You might be willing to say, let's take the non-domestic customers who are already paying charges and ask them to pay 6% more a year in real terms. But if you were to increase the notional domestic charge, DFI does not have the budget cover to rising by 6% a year in real terms to be able to give that to NI Water without hurting the amount of money that it can provide to other people on that front. In terms of sorry, remind me, your first question slipped out of my head straight away.
Basically, just about the type of fund model that each fund model, anyone uses an approach will have its own different challenges and problems.
Yes, absolutely, and some of it, I think, comes back again to funding models have different roles, as Alan was discussing with you before. There is not only the do you have a model which provides some additional resource that is coming into the executive? So, as you rightly imply, the executive's total amount of available capital spending, available resource spending is very, very largely determined by the amount of block grant that it's getting from the UK government. There is the scope to do a bit of borrowing for capital. There is raising regional rates for resource, but both of those are relatively small compared to the size of the overall block grant. The model that you have at the moment is one in which, in order not to have domestic charges, you are having to take some money out of the executive's budget, overall budget, that could be spent on something else, either putting more money into the water and sewerage industry, or alternatively putting it into communities, education, health. So at the end of the day, those are the constraints and the choices that the executive is left to make. But households, consumers, families are affected by those choices one way or another. If you're not having additional cash coming in somehow, then you have consequences for less house building than you would like, less lower quality services or environmental and public health outcomes. So those are the choices, implicitly or explicitly.
So that's great, Robert. Thank you for that. It was clear. There's no quick, easy option, is there, for answer? Thank you, Chair.
No, but we've been looking, 17 years on from a decision not to have charging. You can see no quick answer would be a very understatement.
Thank you. I see Alan was just looking to come in on a point there.
Yeah, just a 30-second intervention, again, in response to Member Brogan's question about is there a good model. I think one of the things that struck me in the discussion around all this is we're very focused on how things are done in Great Britain and on the island of Ireland. And you can make the case that, you know, on the island of Ireland, we have water systems where we just give all the water away, which is rarely a great idea. And then in Britain, possibly let me focus on England, there's a particularly radical form of privatisation, which you could argue hasn't worked terribly well either. But I think if you go to continental Europe, and if anybody amongst you have lived in various parts of continental Europe or the United States, I mean, there's lots of places where the water flows in, the bills flow out, you know what I mean? And this all works. So I just think in terms of looking to the future, there's probably a whole load of models out there that work rather seamlessly. It's just we're closer to the ones that I think are particularly dysfunctional.
And I think that's a good point. I mean, in terms of the committee, we had a research paper, and we did look at some of the models elsewhere in other parts of Europe and things like that contained within that. So we have been looking at that in terms of an infrastructure committee, in terms of research to get back as well, which has been interesting to take a look at. I'm going to move to Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, folks, for your work and your presentation. Obviously, it's a considerable amount of work has went into it. Just keen to know, have you had or is there any engagement plan with the Infrastructure Minister currently, or with any other members of the executive? I appreciate Jonathan mentioned around official level, but has there been any engagement? Obviously, it's very positive and helpful to have this report in place, but obviously, it's not designed just to sit on a shelf somewhere either.
No, well, with all of our reports, we're obviously very happy to talk to anybody who would find them useful to do so. I'm not sure from Jonathan may know whether we've yet had any particular approach from the Minister on this, but obviously delighted to be here talking to you with it. We had the launch, which was an opportunity to engage with a lot of different sorts of stakeholders, including, thank you very much, those of you who came along to that. We're very keen to talk to whoever this would be helpful for. But Jonathan, I don't know if there's any particular engagement requests that we've had so far that would be appropriate to flag.
No, nothing to flag.
Okay, it would, I suppose, be alarming that an infrastructure minister, hasn't reached out to yourselves, obviously with the expertise and the work that you have done in terms of coming up with a report like this, given the significance of the issue as you've outlined and the impact that it is having as we stand today, the impact right across our country and so many issues. So hopefully that maybe can be explored further going forward. And you mentioned just within the report that you have a second stream of work, I presume underway or going to be underway. Is there any more time frame upon that and upon a further report?
Not at this stage. I mean, we decided when doing thinking about the second string of the requirements on the council. So the first thing is to basically try to explain how the executive is or isn't balancing its budget. We do that, as you know, on an ongoing basis. On the longer term sustainability, we obviously did the work on which led to the discussion around the needs number, the 124, how you think about sustainability in the context of a jurisdiction which has the sorts of taxing and borrowing powers that Northern Ireland did. The next focus was on health, which is obviously by far the largest part of the current resource day-to-day budget for the executive, and then it felt that infrastructure was the next most logical one to turn to. Within that, something on infrastructure more generally, and where capital spending is going. I think that might be something that we probably turn to next. The other one would be TransLink and transport, but at the moment we don't have any concrete timetable on that, and partly that's a consequence of the fact that the where the council is going to be in terms of its legal status and its membership over the coming months isn't clear yet. So what we don't want to do is to sort of embark on some long-running piece of work and then discover that the whole committee ends up being turned over in the middle of the process. So but hopefully something on the sort of the more general infrastructure and capital budget might be the next one along the line.
Okay, thank you. And just in terms of, obviously our businesses, do pay water rates. Is there any assessment of the comparison in terms of, the level that they pay compared to, say, the rest of the UK, for example?
I think Maureen might be able to help you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, we don't explicitly look at it in the report, and I know obviously, I think it's something that we haven't looked at it, but it's obviously something that's gaining momentum, particularly obviously with the developer contributions piece as well, and what that might do. I mean, I suppose there is a business lobby around the fact that, you know, this is arguably putting increased burden on businesses. And I mean, what we have seen, through the report is just in terms of consultation around, the fact that, in spite of that levy, it is actually starting to damage investment, so not just housing, but you're actually seeing it in terms of some of the consultation around expansion of Indigenous and foreign-owned companies in Northern Ireland and what that's meant. So I think it's something that I say we haven't looked at it explicitly, but it's obviously a next step from a policy perspective in terms of what that does to incentivize or not how the business economy develops.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Peter McReynolds.
Thank you, Chair. And Alan has actually taken my first question. So I'm wondering if you maybe build on what you were saying there, Alan. Does anywhere in the world provide water the way we do? Because I've looked into this as well, and I'm not seeing many other countries that actually approach it in the way that we do. So can you speak to that?
I can't claim to be an expert on it, but as I said, the notion of a completely free at the point of use supply of water just strikes me as somewhat unusual. And it may be possible for people to point to examples of this elsewhere, but I just can't think of that many beyond these islands. So again, I mean, I'm just sort of dwelling on personal experience on this. That again, a whole load of places that you live, your water bill comes in, and that's just part of life. So apart from that, is that I can't claim to have the specific expertise, so I better not try and point to anything beyond that.
Then secondly, Maureen, you were saying when you were speaking earlier that we pay 54% less, I think it was. Are you able to put a figure as to what that might be per household, what we're roughly on average paying? Because I remember looking into this about a decade or so ago, and the figure that was commonly said was households were paying £160. Are you able to update that figure as to what we are roughly paying now, but obviously we're unaware of what we're paying?
I mean, well, the average bill, annual bill would be, it's about just over 1,200 per household in Northern Ireland. But just to give you a range of it ranges then from about 1,400 in Scotland to 1,900 in Wales. So those are kind of in England in between. So those are the kinds of averages in terms of the council rates. But then whenever you take the water charges on top of that, you're heading up around the kind of, we obviously sit at the 1,200 per household, and it goes up to over 2,000 on average for the for England and Wales, obviously with the water charges there. So that's the kind of differential there is. And I say the context being, you would want to put that in the context of disposable income with households, but it just gives you an average of back to that issue around, do we or do we not already pay for water charges indirectly through our rates?
Yeah.
And if by any chance you have the report to hand, if you look on page 37, there's a table there which we've tried to pull together the most recent information on the sort of average council tax or rates per dwelling and water and sewage, and the numbers are as Maureen described them. And we've also put in the average household disposable income there too, which obviously shows that part of an explanation why you would expect bills to be lower in Northern Ireland on average in total is that you have lower average household disposable income, but nonetheless that would probably still be true if you had some domestic charging put on top as well.
Nicola. I think it's something that really needs watched, and as I said, because those additional charges are going to be put on households. I think was it our rates were in real terms didn't move for the last year or so, whereas if you start to look at the kind of movement in England and Wales, for example, in terms of average charges, you'll see those go up and that gap widening as well over time.
Okay. Nicola mentioned about England and Wales earlier. I mean, in terms of the Scottish model, don't they have measures in place to protect people who may struggle if something like this was implemented? How's the Scottish model set up, and how are they able to work within that to ensure that people are as protected as much as possible?
I'm not. Again, I'll yield to any colleagues who've got more detail on how the Scottish system operate. But as we said in a couple of answers ago, I think if you were to introduce charging, the idea that it's pretty likely that you would need to do some sort of structuring of the charge, or some sort of way of ensuring that the poorest households were protected or cushioned to some degree, and that would, depending on how generous that was, reduce the amount of money that you would bring in overall. But I'm afraid I don't have, unless colleagues do, a chapter and verse on how Scottish Water or the Scottish Government does that.
I'm just going to jump in and say that on page 35, there's a table which summarises at the sort of high level the differences between the jurisdictions, and it's got Scotland in there. You'll see it's a government-owned company, public corporation. So it's more similar perhaps to what we've got here, and I haven't seen the same level of criticism as maybe there is of England and Wales, but it still obviously charges domestic customers.
And the key thing in Scotland is it's a choice. So you can either choose to have it essentially as something that's added to your council tax, which presumably therefore is more related to property value, or you could have something that is a choice to have metering.
I attended last week, and my main takeaway was the cost of not doing anything, and the impact that that's having. You know, obviously for the last 17 years, the same discussions have been taking place. The elephant in the room being that we're not addressing major issues within Northern Ireland Water, which I think your report lays bare. I'll regularly talk in this committee and in the chamber about the human waste that we see in Belfast Lough, burst storm overflows leading to human waste in the roads as well. The impact that that's having on our economy, lack of being able to build housing, the lack of jobs that could be created. Did you look at the impact that lack of action is actually having upon not addressing this issue?
Well, I mean, implicitly, I think partly, obviously, that comes through the length of time that it's estimated you would need to have increased investment to clear the backlog and to sort out those areas of Northern Ireland where there are serious constraints on potential development. I think that we did quote somewhere in the report, I now can't remember, an estimate of the sort of the job implications of the development constraints, but I think we were referring to a study from some time ago. But you're absolutely right. It's important to consider the consequences for households and families' well-being of inaction as well as action in terms of where resources are diverted, and also the fact that you have less being spent on dealing with the development bottlenecks. And arguably on public health and environmental outcomes too. And I think if you look at the rationale for Ofwat deciding that you really need to have big real increases in charges in England and Wales, now partly that may implicitly be down to the fact that obviously there's a lot of concern around the performance of those companies more broadly, but I think it's also you're going to need to do that given the greater attention that is paid to the environmental and public health considerations. So you're absolutely right. There are consequences to doing nothing, as well as consequences for doing something more to bring more revenue in.
And then just lastly from me.
Sorry, Peter, if you don't mind, I see Alan has his hand up there, just if he's looking in on that point as well.
This is for you, Chair. I see Member Buchanan's hand is up as well.
Yes, I have him noted down here, yeah.
Grant, I'll go ahead. No, just on the issue of the cost of doing nothing, it did strike me in our deliberations that if this was happening in a European Union country, one of the mechanisms to actually get some action here would be for somebody to go and sue the Water Authority for perceived breaches of its environmental responsibilities. Now, I have to confess, I don't know enough about the situation in Northern Ireland, but increasingly where legislation has been passed, which is sort of obviously a sort of a sustainability or an environmentally friendly lens, it does open to a much greater extent the possibility of organisations, be it Friends of the Earth or whatever like that, to sue. And I mean, ironically, I think when we were talking to Northern Ireland Water, I almost put it to them: is this something that they borderline welcome? Because it, it could sort of play well for them in terms of getting the additional resources. But just in terms of the member's question about the cost of doing nothing, partly in the context of Lough Neagh and other things, I do sometimes wonder if that ultimately the decision could potentially be taken out of the executive and moved into the courts.
And just on that point, I know the committee, we are aware of enforcement action that is happening in terms of NI Water, in terms of some of the breaches and pollution incidences, which we've also looked at. Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, the DAERA Minister is looking at this and making sure that Northern Ireland's playing its part, Northern Ireland Water is playing its part in addressing those issues. There's a variety of reasons as to why our waterways are as impacted as they are, why Lough Neagh is as impacted as it is as well, and we're addressing that issue. But just lastly, multi-annual funding is something that's been talked about quite a lot, and it might be a way for Northern Ireland Water to be more strategic with how they spend their budget allocation. In terms of that, doing nothing or continuing or changing something or changing nothing, can you tell me what should get more priority? Is it addressing the revenue coming into Northern Ireland Water to address the issues, or is it having that strategic focus in terms of multi-annual funding? Would they be able to plan ahead better with multi-annual funding, or is it still the elephant in the room, is that our system is completely inefficient?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we're making the point that fundamentally there's a budgetary issue here and the need for more money to be found from somewhere in order to spend here. In terms of the multi-annual funding picture, obviously one paradox is that you have price control, so the agreements or rather the contracts that eventually end up between the utility regulator and NI Water. The last one was over a sort of 6-year period. It's actually, I think, now been extended to a 7-year period. But as you know, at the level of the executive as a whole, we've had 11 single-year budgets in a row. We are now, tentatively hoping that with the UK government having essentially 3-year spending reviews every 2 years, so that they overlap, there's a bit more scope for certainty over this period. But at the end of the day, as the NI Audit Office pointed out, you don't have, just because NI Water is regulated and there are legal requirements, etc., it doesn't have funding that's sort of ring-fenced or earmarked over an extended period of years. And so while the finances of the executive are still, you discover as the UK government changes its spending policy, that increases or reduces the size of the block grant. So DFI is not going to be that confident of exactly how much money it's going to have to spend over, over a number of years, and therefore there's a limited amount of confidence you can give to NI Water, unless you were actually to say, let's ring fence, let's be explicitly saying that this is the first priority, but then you're simply pushing essentially the consequences of budget volatility onto other parts of the infrastructure department budget. So maybe it ends up as more of an issue for TransLink then at that stage. So greater multi-year certainty, or not so much certainty, greater ability to plan over the longer term is clearly helpful and desirable. But when the overall funding of the executive is still, affected very largely by decisions that are not taken by the executive, but by the UK government, there's only so far you can go with that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Keith Buchanan is online there. Keith?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I just want to go back to Alan. Alan, the conversation you had was previously with respect to developer contribution and what that'll do. I heard a radio report the other day, and there's builders and developers on that, and you made the point that money is going to basically be passed on to first-time homeowners. They made the figure that could be £10,000 to £15,000. So if developer contributions goes ahead, is that not water charges by the back door to the unfortunate young people, and broadly young people that are going to be first-time buyers?
I mean, the straight answer is yes. I mean, the precise extent to which something like a levy gets translated into the price of a house. There's a sort of a technical strand in the economics literature about market structure and the extent to which people are in perfectly competitive markets or more oligopolistic markets. But it's generally the question of the incidence of taxation. Okay, and it often comes up, although a tax can be, in this case, a levy can be applied to one group. It can actually sort of manifest to the other. Just to give you the reverse of that, for many years here in the Republic, we had first-time buyers grants. Okay, and the argument was that probably only increased the house of the price as well. You know what I mean? That the politician liked the idea of giving young married couples or whatever like that a grant. But I mean, if everybody showed up to the auction with that money in their pocket, that tended to bid up the house. The price, you know, so this was really a transfer to developers in that case. So I mean, the roundabout answer is it's likely that if there is a development levy, that it will get passed on in some shape or form and at some level.
And I don't know whether you can answer this directly, Alan, or whoever else, Robert. So, Robert, is developer-led contribution a good idea?
Well, it's a reasonable part of the overall picture. I think if you're looking at the amounts of money that NI Water, the utility regulators, have sort of implied over the longer term, I think it was the NIAO quoted a possibility of needing sort of 350 million a year in 2021 prices over quite an extended period to deal with backlogs. The idea that you would get sums of money of that sort or be able to get a large contribution from that for developer contributions doesn't seem very likely. So it could help at the margin, but it's not as much of a game changer as something bigger on regional rates or domestic charging itself will be. But Alan, I don't know whether there's anything you'd add on that.
No, Robert, it's just one of these things I haven't thought about in quite a while, up until we were discussing it this morning. So I better not add too significantly to my earlier remarks in case I say something incorrect.
And one other question, Chair, if I may, briefly. Cathal mentioned this, and I think you did as well, Sir Robert, but £590 approximate as a notional average of a figure required, right, to accumulate 350 million. So if there's 841,000 approximately homes in Northern Ireland, roughly in that league, how many of those would be paying, or how do you know what way that equation was calculated? How many of those homes would be paying to equate that 350 million, roughly? Do you know where that come from?
Well, as I say, and Jonathan may be able to correct me on this, the 590 figure is a calculation by the utility regulator of what the notional average household charge would be in 2025-26, and that's higher than it has been in the past, partly because retail price inflation has been higher than anticipated, and there's a link through on that. So I'm trying to remember, and Jonathan may have to remind me as to whether that's an average per household or an average per dwelling. Can you remember?
No, I think it's per household, Robert, but I can't recall. I think the calculations that we've done were per household.
Yeah. The 350 million figure that I was referring to a moment ago was an estimate, I think, that the Northern Ireland Audit Office attributed to NI Water of how much money would be needed to be spent over an extended period of time in order to deal with the development constraint backlog. Again, if I've not misremembered.
Okay, it's hard to know if we hear different conversations. Well, it's the Tories we blame, the British government we blame, the Labour government, the finance minister, the infrastructure minister. But I see narratives now changing. It used to be the bad old Tories, now it's the British government, but we've now a Labour government. So we'll see what changes that made, and no doubt the spending review conversations that was had by the Minister of Finance a few weeks ago, we'll see how that all developed or develops into actual money on the ground and solutions. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate that, and Maureen, appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. There's an awful lot of fingers pointing in an awful lot of different directions, but look, If you don't mind, there was two questions that I had sort of in my head, and I could spend all day talking about this, and we have run over time, which just shows the importance of this topic, particularly for this committee and obviously the Assembly as a whole, because it impacts on so many departments and on homes right across Northern Ireland. You did talk about the fact that you've had regular engagement and discussions with Treasury in relation to the funding streams, and as you mentioned in your report, Treasury rules mean that NI Water can't carry forward unspent DEL from 1 year to the next without permission, even though this might enhance value for money and one thing and another, and it's an interesting point. I know from my own party, but I know parties have obviously been lobbying Treasury, the executive have been lobbying Treasury, and my own party has been looking at the level of need and spend per head of population, as we don't feel that that's adequate for Northern Ireland. But in terms of your discussions with Treasury, have they been agnostic to making changes regarding that unspent DEL and being able to carry that forward? Because essentially those are the people that can make changes to essentially help NI Water in that element.
Well, I mean, our discussions with Treasury on this have really been limited to, do we understand how this rather complicated system works or not, rather than questioning. I wouldn't expect them to give me answers on how they might think things might change. I mean, these are those sorts of constraints, for example, around the inability to carry forward unused DEL into the following year. That's not some sort of, bespoke rule that the Treasury has decided to impose on NI Water. It's the way in which it treats bodies with this sort of classification. And obviously one challenge for them, if you were to make the case in a particular, say, for, well, couldn't you make it a bit easier for this particular entity to do that, is that you're then opening up a whole can of worms about whether you get similar requests for freedoms elsewhere. We do highlight in the report, I think, a couple of examples, and again, I think there was one on roads, possibly one on Network Rail as well, again, as to where there has been greater freedom, but that typically, I think, comes along with the need to have earmarked funding at the same time. So it's not, as I say, that the Treasury has decided to wield a particularly heavy baseball bat over this particular company. It's the way in which they're trying to set the rules across these institutions as a whole. So the fact that the way in that it's the spending of non-departmental public bodies and roughly the income or the financing for public corporations that scores against the Treasury rules is something that's set at a higher level across the whole system, rather than something that's particularly bespoke or aimed at disadvantaging or advantaging Northern Ireland.
Okay, and I'm playing a wee bit of devil's advocate here with this question, and I'm aware of that because I know that you advise on one thing and another, but I did note, and I have to say it did raise a smile on my face on page 25, and that was around the greater transparency around DFI's indicative and ultimate then DEL allocations. And you mentioned in your report that it's hard to keep track of how NI Water's resource DEL and capital DEL allocations and provisional allocations and worst case scenarios evolve over time. And I have to say, from a committee perspective, that can often be difficult as well. And we're not experts in terms of finance. We're relying on looking at the figures. And I suppose it was interesting to note that you said if and when DFI decides not to allocate resources necessary to meet the utility regulator's recommendations, it should explain clearly to the public and its Assembly Committee why it has done so. Obviously, we're the Assembly Committee that scrutinises everything. So what was it that you noticed, I suppose? Obviously, we know from our aspect of scrutinising the budget and looking at it and how difficult that can be at times. But what was it that you picked up on or noticed, or something that could be done differently to ensure that there is a greater level of transparency around looking at those figures?
I think part of the difficulty here is, as we were trying to write a narrative of explaining, essentially how the adequacy of funding, the relationship between the budget cover and what the utility regulator thinks is necessary, what might be in a business in an NI Water business plan, what decision, where the decisions of DFI come out, is that we were having to pick around a whole lot of different documents produced for different audiences and for different purposes. Now, all of these entities are producing and doing the reporting that they're supposed to be doing, as far as I'm aware, in all these different ways. But when you have this complex model in which you've got sort of different lenses through which to look at things, and you have, determinations published by the utility regulator, you have, worst or best case scenarios for available funding by DFI. We've tried to put that together as best we could in some of the narrative we have here. For example, looking at successive going concern statements in NI Water's accounts to get a view of where they think that funding has come in above or below necessity. So I think really it's basically saying if you and others have a continued interest in this subject, rather than the next time you want to go to it, somebody has to scramble around all these different documents and try to assemble it together. If it was possible to have a sort of agreement with yourselves, the department, NI Water, and the utility regulator of what are the numbers that you are interested in keeping an eye on as you're regularly monitoring and watching this in your activities. Is there a way that you can sort of provide a regularly updated flow of those sorts of figures that will be a benefit for you, rather than having to go back to square one and chase them around every time you think you want to ask that question?
Okay, well, sorry.
Just to say, I think even the exercise in itself of doing this research and this report identified the challenges was trying to get information, and I think that in itself, and hopefully even in doing this report, it suggests a pathway forward in terms of what should be asked and what should be on the table, and trying to understand this better and faster, I think, as well. I think that's really important.
And Luke, we'll be very soon we'll be looking at the forensic accountants report as well into NI Water as well. So it's coming on the hot on the heels of the work that you have done as well. But look, as I said, we've massively run over time today. That was an hour and a half there, I think. So, but as I say, it does just show the importance of this, and I want to thank you for the work that you have done in relation to this report, which will help in terms of our look and investigation from a committee perspective into the sustainability of NI Water. I think all of us want the same thing for Northern Ireland, and that's that we have a better way of doing things. So I appreciate your time today, I really do, and sorry for keeping you. And thank you for your evidence today. We do greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for your interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye. Okay, members, I just wanted to check if there's anything that anybody wants to clarify coming out of that. Remember, we do have the Minister coming up to the committee next week, and as I say, we will have as well the forensic accountant and from the department. We will have the NI Water Forensic Financial Review next week as well, so just to bear that in mind. Are members content? There was nothing further you wanted to ask? Okay, I'm moving on then. Item 12 is our forward work programme, and you'll see at page 243 the draft forward work programme. Something just that I wanted to pick up on was, remember we had the Interim Regional Planning Commission in to the committee. Their report was due, and I think it wouldn't do any harm for us to check if they have reported yet. If not, when are they hoping to report? And obviously for ourselves to get a briefing in relation to that. Are you content that we scope that out? Yeah. Okay, thank you, members. So you'll see there on page 43 the draft forward work programme. So I'm just seeking agreement that we proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the Forward Work Programme, and obviously to reflect that with the Interim Regional Planning Commission. Are you content? Yeah.
Great, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Item 13 is any other business. Has any other members have any other items of business they want to raise? No? Okay, thank you. So members, the date, time and location of the next meeting will be Wednesday the 25th of June here in room 29 Parliament Buildings at 10 a.m. I look forward to seeing you next week. And I adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Committee Room 29, Sound.